Hello, I'm Matteo, the Chief Mobile Opinionist here at Tech Travel Geeks. And just before we say goodbye to the Google Pixel 5, I thought it would be a good idea to do a side-by-side comparison between the Google Pixel 6 Pro and its predecessor, the Google Pixel 5. These are two smartphones from Google, arguably both flagship devices from Google, in the Pixel lineup, and two completely different years, two completely different products. It's very, very interesting to see what the differences and similarities are. Right then, let's start off from the hardware. It's noticeable that the Google Pixel 5 is smaller. The Google Pixel 5 was the peak of the industrial design Google used with the Google Pixel 4 series devices and then the Google Pixel 5. In this case, this was the green version of the Google Pixel 5. It had a plastic-coated metal frame. It's a metal phone, but it has a really nice plastic coating that gives it a soft feel and makes it less slippery. It's obviously a smaller device, and overall it's very, very simple. It's minimalistic. And you can see that from the camera module to the fingerprint scanner in the back of the device, and it was just as simple as possible. Whereas with the Google Pixel 6 Pro, Google definitely took a step into the unknown. They went with a very recognizable design with a Geordie LaForge visor for the camera module, and we'll go into a bit more detail why they have this large camera module, because ultimately it's very, very, very functional. There's a reason for that being there, rather than just having a little square in the corner. In this case, the sort of sunshine version of the device has a slightly darker yellow or orange bit at the top, and then the camera bump itself sticks out significantly. And then the back of the device is glass, so it's all glass at the top, metal all around. It's from an industrial standpoint, a design standpoint, it's very, very different. Now, they're both devices that were flagships, but in 2020, when the Google Pixel 5 launched, it was the only version of the phone they launched. There was no Pixel 5 XL. There was no Pixel 5 Pro. So the Pixel 6 Pro is, in a way, taking the Google Pixel product portfolio a step up compared to how it had done previously. Now, we've looked at the backs and the sort of casing and the shape of them. The front is a completely different story as well. You'll notice that the front of the devices have two very different size screens, but the key thing is that the Google Pixel 6 Pro has an in-screen fingerprint reader, whereas the Google Pixel 5 has a physical fingerprint reader in the back of the device. Now, just looking at the devices, they're completely different sizes. You can see that the Google Pixel 5 is smaller. The screen is significantly smaller. In the case of the Google Pixel 5, with a full high definition plus resolution, it's just 6 inches in diagonal. And in this wide aspect ratio, it is essentially a small phone. Whereas the Google Pixel 6 Pro is a 6.7 inch diagonal screen. And it's a step up, it's Quad HD resolution. So significant differences there in terms of usability, in terms of the general bulk, and the carryability, as in you need to have a deep pocket to put the Google Pixel 6 Pro in. So in terms of that, the screens, there's also another thing to bear in mind. The Google Pixel 6 Pro has a curved screen. It essentially tricks you into believing it's a smaller, slimmer smartphone. This is something that we've seen for years from Samsung, from Huawei, from LG, from lots of different brands. It's not the first time we've seen this, but Google have taken a step into the unknown here. As I said, it's a recurring theme with the Google Pixel 6 Pro, and it is noticeable how much bigger the device is from the get-go. The other thing is obviously the notch that's cut out for the selfie camera in the two cases is in different places. On the Google Pixel 5, it's on the left-hand side. On the Google Pixel 6 Pro, it's out there in the middle. So, in-screen fingerprints reader, both devices have AMOLED displays or OLED displays. They are lovely, lovely screens with good color saturation, high contrast ratio. They are really good screens in both cases. The other big difference here is that the Google Pixel 5 had a 90 Hz refresh rate, which was great, perfectly good. I'm not a super big fan of high refresh rates. I don't think they bring that much value to the table, but it is sometimes noticeable. Whereas the Google Pixel 6 Pro took it a whole step up to 120 Hz. Obviously, that's not on everything. It will be dictated by the operating system where you do get that high refresh rate. But in both cases, very smooth, very overall pleasant experience on those lovely displays. Now, both devices have these big displays and software pretty much optimized for them. The operating system Android does a good job of resizing and scaling elements up and down for what you're doing. But the ergonomics on the Google Pixel 6 Pro are a little bit more clunky because you've got a bigger screen. Sometimes stuff is at the top. It becomes a bit more difficult to handle it. That's my experience. I do prefer the smaller body of the Google Pixel 5, but that's just my personal preference. Now, obviously, operating systems, when the Google Pixel 5 launched, it launched with Android 11. When the Google Pixel 6 Pro launched, it launched with Android 12. In this case, my Google Pixel 5 got the update pretty much immediately to Android 12, and it's very, very similar as we look at the operating system. It is essentially the same, just it's, in my view, more usable on the smaller screen. Now, obviously, the operating system is important, but even more important than that in the experience on a smartphone is often the chipset, the setup of what is running in the device. The Google Pixel 5 made a point of not running a flagship chipset. It was running a Snapdragon 765 5G. This was a 7nm chip, which was a sort of high-end, mid-tier chipset from Qualcomm that did provide 5G. It was an octa-core chipset, which performed really, really well. I didn't find it lacking when even doing intense things like exporting video or playing games. Whereas the Google Pixel 6 Pro went into the unknown. This is the first Google Pixel device with a tensor chip. So this chipset is a 5nm chipset, inherently more efficient, less power hungry, but this uses a completely different architecture and is optimized for AI. It's not an off-the-shelf chipset like we saw on the Google Pixel 5. The Google Pixel 6 Pro has its own Google chip, which is impressive. In terms of RAM and storage, both of them are non-expandable. The Google Pixel 5 and the Google Pixel 6 Pro, you can't expand them. The Google Pixel 5 came in one setup, in one memory configuration. That was 128GB of storage and 8GB of RAM. Everything was there. Whereas with the Google Pixel 6 Pro, you have the options of more storage if you want them. So there's 128GB storage, 256 or 512GB of storage, 3 options in this device, but all of them have 12GB of RAM. That's pretty much insane in my view. That's more than recent laptops that I've reviewed on the Tech Travel Geeks YouTube channel. So it is really, really impressive, and that extra memory in a way gives you an extra performance boost at those high demand applications, such as exporting video, as I sometimes do on my device from either the drone app or Google Photos, or in the case of Premiere Rush on the device from Adobe. So lots of options there, but it is noticeable how much more powerful the Google Pixel 6 Pro is if you're a power user. If, on the other hand, you're just a normal smartphone user who doesn't do those things, the difference is negligible. Now, let's talk about the front of the screen and those selfie cameras. We said the Pixel 5 had one at the top left-hand corner, and the Pixel 6 Pro has it in the middle. So these cameras are very, very different as well. So the Google Pixel 5 selfie camera is an 8 megapixel one. It was a decent one. It does automatic HDR, but it only recorded video at 1080p or full HD. Whereas on the Google Pixel 6 Pro, it was definitely a step up in terms of cameras, especially with the selfie camera, because the camera on the Google Pixel 6 Pro is an 11.1 megapixel one, and it's much wider in terms of what it can capture. So if you're taking a picture of a group, it is a much easier device to take that selfie with. Now, cameras at the front aren't all the difference. We talked about the cameras on the back and that Geordi LaForge visor on the back. That's because the Google Pixel 5 really didn't change anything since the Google Pixel 1. It was almost 5 iterations of Google Pixel devices. There were minor changes to the camera. Around about the Google Pixel 2, you got optical image stabilization in the camera, and that was a great thing to see. But the Google Pixel 5 just added a wide-angle lens to the setup, and that was it. It was all about software for Google. Whereas with the Google Pixel 6 Pro, they went absolutely nuts with the cameras. This whole visor is functional. There is stuff in there that is actually useful. The main sensor is a 50 megapixel sensor. It's f/1.9, it's a 25mm wide-angle lens. It is a really, really good camera, especially when paired with Google software. This is where the Google Pixel 5 was the swan song to the 12 megapixel sensor. With the Google Pixel 6 Pro, it went boom, 50 megapixels. And as well as that, there's a 48 megapixel telephoto lens. You see that here. It's actually a periscope lens. It's the same technology we saw in the Huawei P30 Pro. The light goes in, gets reflected sideways, and the sensor is somewhere down here. And it is a really good telephoto lens. So zooming with the Google Pixel 6 Pro, zooming when you're taking, for example, a 4x zoom picture, it is seamless and really, really good. Going further is a bit of a challenge, but 4x zoom is very good. And then it just wraps off with the last one. It's a 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor, which is very, very good, but sometimes has slightly muted colors compared to the other two sensors, the telephoto and the main one. And there is also laser autofocus on the main sensor that allows you to take those really good pictures. It is an impressive camera setup all round. Whereas the Google Pixel 5 had a 12 megapixel main sensor and a 16 megapixel ultra wide. Nothing too fancy, but it punched well above its weight in terms of specifications on paper. The output on this device was impressive. So now you understand why this industrial design, this Geordi LaForge visor, because there's an extra sensor in there, but there's also a lot more there. They're larger sensors, they capture more light, they perform better in low light. Now, both devices were capable of recording video in 4K at 30 or 60 frames per second. In my experience, the video quality was much better on the Google Pixel 6 Pro. Definitely one to bear in mind. So, in terms of connectivity, at the bottom, there's not much to say. Both devices followed in the Fruity company's trend of removing the headphone jack. There is no headphone jack. So both devices have USB Type-C. It does, the Google Pixel 5 does do fast charging, but it was 18 watt charging, so it's USB power delivery, or PD, and it was pretty decent. It would charge the device pretty well. Whereas the Google Pixel 6 Pro steps up the game further. It's a 30 watt fast charger, and it also has a larger battery. The Google Pixel 6 Pro has, in this case, a 5000 milliamp hour battery, and the Google Pixel 5 had a 4000 milliamp hour battery. Having a smaller screen, having maybe a less power hungry chipset for some day-to-day tasks, the Google Pixel 5 and the Google Pixel 6 Pro are pretty much similar in terms of endurance in day-to-day use. In real use, they'll get you through a day, and you can put it on charge on a slow charger overnight and won't have any issues. It is something that once you start getting into a certain schedule for charging, it's not something that will affect you much. If they can make it through a day of heavyish use, that's fine with me. So we've talked about pretty much everything on the device. One of the things that I wanted to call out is sound. The Google Pixel 5 had stereo sound, so it had the main sound coming out of the bottom of the device, but it also had the top of the device produce some sound through that earpiece. So you were getting, if slightly unbalanced, but decent sound when not connected to Bluetooth earphones or when you're actually listening to content. Whereas on the Google Pixel 6 Pro, the sound quality over stereo is much, much better. The top speaker and the bottom ones are tuned much better and seem to produce more pleasant sound. There's something to be said for that bigger chassis and that bigger body. It does actually give you all that in terms of sound quality. But in reality, I've been using both devices pretty much without sound out loud. I've been using Bluetooth headphones and had no issues connecting via Bluetooth. Obviously, these are Google Pixel devices. They have NFC, and that means you can use them for mobile payments. Great experience on there. And it also allowed me to, for example, pair my smartwatch and quickly connect to devices like Bluetooth headphones using NFC. So great features there. So that's the key differences and similarities between the devices. I'm going to be saying goodbye to the Google Pixel 5. Someone who needs a new device is going to be looking after this device going forward. It's been a pleasure to use this device over the years, because it's now almost 2 years since we got this in the autumn of 2020. It has been a great device, but it's time to say goodbye and move on to the Google Pixel 6 Pro. We cover consumer electronics, gadgets, smartphones, pretty much anything we think makes the travel experience better. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of our coverage of Pixel devices, other smartphones, even the fruity ones, please do subscribe to the Tech Travel Geeks here on YouTube. For now, I'll wrap up this video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye from me.